Hi again. So our website now looks like the following for this module, and we're covering this card here in this lecture. In fact, you can see from the title at the top of the card, I'm actually going to be covering two separate kind of topics behind this card. So if we go into it, I'm breaking this section up into two lectures. First, we'll discuss navigation or routing, how we add different routes to our app. And the second one is where I will talk about the actual design process associated with developing a React app. Something I've mentioned a number of times in earlier lectures, so it's probably time now to address it. The lab, again, is just a continuation of the movies fan app that we began in the previous lecture. There's also an archive with this in this section. The archive is linked to the navigation or routing material that I'll be covering. So let's talk about navigation or routing in relation to React. And really what I'm trying to achieve here is, or what we want to achieve here is to be able to have multiple views or pages in our app. Up to now, our apps have consisted of just one view, but more realistic applications would have multiple views. So how do we add that feature to our app? So the objective, yeah, is to actually have multiple views, but of critical importance is that as the user navigates around from view to view in our app, the URL in the browser's address bar needs to change as well. So this idea of keeping what's currently displayed on the screen, the current view or page that's being displayed, that needs to be kept in sync with the URL that appears in the browser's address bar and vice versa. And really the software is going to do that for us. I'm also mentioning there the idea of having flows in your app. We won't cover it, but what I mean by a flow is if you think of your typical checkout procedure, if you're doing any online shopping where you go through a number of steps before you complete the checkout, we refer to that as a flow. And that's essentially just navigation as well going on there. Now, this idea of having multiple views and having the URL in sync with the views, that's really harping back to one of the principal aspects of the web itself. If we think of the days of the static web where we just had websites, one of the real nice features of websites was as we navigated from page to page, the URL in the browser changed. We refer to that as the addressability characteristic of the web. Each page had a unique address. And the advantage of that is that if I wanted to share or make you aware of a particular page on a particular website, you didn't have to sort of go to the home page of the website and then I would explain to you how to get to the page I wanted to share with you. All I needed to do was just give you the unique URL address of that page within the website, and you got straight to it. So as I said, that's referred to as this addressability characteristic. And addressability facilitated information sharing and also this idea of deep linking. All of these three characteristics of the web are interlinked. Well, in a similar way, we want that aspect to our React apps. If you think maybe, for example, in context of the movies app that we're developing in the labs, if I wanted to share a particular review about a particular movie with you, then I would just give you the unique URL of the view within my app, which would allow you to go straight to the view or page that had the information about the review on the particular movie. Okay, so that's kind of the objective, multiple views and keeping the browser's URL in sync with the view. Now, All of this is actually going to be achieved using a separate library from the core React libraries. The React team, design team, decided that they wanted to keep the React framework as small as possible. And so one of the aspects that they didn't address was routing or navigation. Now, there are a couple of libraries out there that we could use in conjunction with React to add navigation to our apps, but I'm going to use probably the most popular one, which is called React Router. So let's get straight into it really and see how do we kind of program this, this React Router library. So if we take a simple example, now the samples that I'm going to cover for the remainder of this lecture, they are part of, the archive accompanying this section in the website. So if usual story, you download the archive, unzip it, and import it into VS Code or whichever IDE you use. And that's what we will be looking at. So let's suppose we have this objective. We have this app and we want it to have 3 views. The root view, which is going to be our home page, let's say. There's going to be a view which will have the URL /about, and that's going to display my about page. And I have another view which is going to have the URL /inbox, and that's going to display my inbox page. Let's say this is some sort of email client that we're developing here. So in the table there, I'm saying that each of the URLs is linked to a particular component. And if you think of the components, maybe more in terms of mini little component hierarchies. So the home component there may have a number of child components connected to it. It won't be in the case of the code that I'm showing you, but in real life it might be. And equally for the other 2 components there, they would probably have child components as well. So I'm only documenting the kind of top component in the hierarchies for each of these 3 pages or views. So the React Router library allows us to express the routing or navigation requirements of our app using JSX syntax. So, which is quite nice. It means it's tightly kind of aligned with the whole kind of React programming style. And so this bit of routing configuration that we're looking at, I guess the main part you should focus on initially are these 3 lines here. They are expressing the requirements that is specified on the table on the left. And, you know, it's fairly easy to interpret, I think. So if you take the very first routing entry, it's saying if the URL in the browser is /about, then the component, the about component, should be mounted onto the DOM. By the way, now there's no real link between the component name and the path name. They happen to be the same in this case, but that's not a requirement. The second routing entry is similar. It's saying like if the URL in the browser is /inbox, then the inbox component should be mounted. And the third one is saying something similar. So really, the way this kind of works behind the scenes is when the URL in the browser changes, whether that is as a result of the user physically typing something into the URL address bar, or as a result of a hyperlink, once the URL address changes in the browser, this routing configuration kicks in and it makes a decision as to which component to mount and unmount. The first component here, the browser router, it's really responsible for doing that matching between the browser's URL and the individual route path values. Once a particular route entry has been selected, then the associated component is mounted, as I explained there a while ago. You can actually have kind of wildcard characters in the path prop here, because these are really props if you think about it. You can have wildcard characters and certain other regular expression syntax if you wish. It's always a good idea to have a kind of a default entry as well, which is the redirect entry. And really what purpose that serves is if the URL in the browser is not any one of these, then we are telling our routing configuration to essentially redirect the browser back to the root path. And so if the browser's URL now changes to this, that really means that the home component is going to be mounted and the home page is going to be displayed. So that just avoids the redirect entry, avoids the 404 error. The way you can interpret the switch component, which wraps our individual routes, is the switch component only allows the router, the React router, to pick one of the route entries, which is usually what you want anyway. So it's kind of boilerplate. And you'll notice as well in the bottom that, so I've put all of this routing configuration into a component of its own, which I'm calling just the app component there at the top of the code. And it's that component that you attach to the DOM. Okay, and again, that would be a standard feature now of any React app that we will have from here on in. The top component in our component hierarchy is really going to just primarily contain what I'm referring to as a routing configuration for the app. This code and the other code associated with this example is part of the archive that you would have downloaded for this section of the course. And so I've downloaded the archive and unzipped it and imported it into VS Code in my case. And here's what it looks like. So again, this was created using the Create React App tool. Now, the way I've structured this needs just a tiny bit of explanation. So I have a whole series of samples that I need to work through related to navigation and routing in React. And in order to run any one of the samples, what you need to do is you need to go into the base index.js and change it to refer to whichever sample folder you're currently examining. Okay, so it's currently referring to sample one, which is the one that I wanted to. This is just the way I decided to structure this code. So as before, you run npm install on this, and then you run npm start. So I've already done the install part. And if I now do npm start, so based on the routing configuration that we defined, when the URL is like this, in other words, we've got the root path, then we should be seeing the home page, which we are. For now, I'm going to have to manually change the address bar. So if I change it to about, we go to the about page, and if I go to the inbox, it goes to the inbox page. And if it's neither of them, then it returns me back to the home page by default. So let's just quickly look at the code. We have the main part, which is the routing configuration. So if we go into the sample1 folder, and there's only one file there really. I've decided for convenience to put everything into one file. So here's the about page component, the inbox and the home page, and then we have the routing configuration, which we've already looked at. Now, The next thing is adding hyperlinks to our app. The hyperlinks, the idea is it will allow us, it would allow the user to navigate from view to view or from page to page using the traditional kind of hyperlink web idea. But we don't program the hyperlinks using the HTML anchor tag. We use a special component provided by the React Router library called the link component. Now, I am saying there that if you want to have a link somewhere in your React app, which is connecting to some external page or app outside of the app, then you can use the traditional HTML anchor tag for that, okay. But if the purpose of a link within your React app is to allow the user to navigate to another view within the app, then you should use the link component to do that. And in the screenshot there, I'm showing you, let's supposing I want to have these two links in my little simple application, which allows the user to navigate. And this is how we do it. So it's kind of ugly now. I just have the hyperlinks as an unordered list. There's no styling involved, but that doesn't add to what we really want to focus on, which is the link component. And so the link component, as you can see, it takes, well, for now it takes one prop, the top prop, and we just simply assign the top prop the URL, the internal URL that we want the hyperlink to be associated with. And so the idea or the way this is going to work is when the user actually clicks on this hyperlink, the browser's address bar is going to be changed to whatever the prop specifies. And as before, once the browser's URL address bar changes, then the routing configuration, which we've already discussed, that kicks in, and that completes the routing logic for us. So in our case, the URL changes to /about, and the about page or the about component, strictly speaking, is going to be mounted onto the DOM, and that page displayed. Okay, so that's sample 2. So there isn't really a whole lot extra in sample 2 other than what you're seeing here, but just for the sake of it, and also to show you how to use this archive. So what I need to do now is to go back to this index.js and change this from sample 1 to sample 2. And React will do its retranslation, etc., etc. So if I flip over to the browser, I should now really be looking at sample 2, which I am. And the behavior is as we'd expect. Yeah. Quick look at the code. Again, I've taken the easy option, put everything into one file, and here's the home component. That's the only place I have the actual hyperlinks. The rest then is as before. We still have the same routing configuration in this case anyway. And I'm importing the about component and the inbox component from sample 1 because they haven't really changed. Again, just another convenience. That's sample 2. The only point I haven't mentioned is, which is being highlighted here now, is that you should really have absolute paths for your hyperlinks. Don't use relative paths because that can cause problems. And what I'm mentioning down at the bottom is, yeah, we will see later on that the link component gives us access to other kind of routing properties, which will become useful later on. And the last point there, you see in the sample that I have here, the link component doesn't have any inner components or inner elements, but sometimes you want to wrap a link component around some other components. Might be a third-party component that you want to have hyperlinked. And if you do need to do that, instead of using the link component as your wrapper, I'm suggesting you should use the link container component mentioned there at the bottom. Now, the next aspect of routing is what React Router refers to as dynamic segments, but a more common name would be parameterized URLs. And so a parameterized URL, as the name kind of suggests, is where the URL contains a parameter embedded within it. And that parameter would be used by your application for some purpose, usually maybe to make an open API call using the parameter value. So just by way of example, this here might be a URL associated with an application, a React application that we're developing, where, or at least this is the pattern, where the 22 here actually would refer to perhaps user whose ID was 22. But that could be any value here, okay? Similarly, in this example, the 12 would be, is more than likely a parameter value. So the issue is, in our routing configuration, how do we indicate in these URLs that part of the URL is actually a parameter as opposed to a kind of a static string? And secondly, in the component that is mounted as a result of the URL resulting in the user's address bar, how does the component actually access the parameter value? So if we bring it into the context of the little sample application, let's supposing we now want to be able to support a URL like this, where the inbox is followed by a parameter, and that in this case may refer to the inbox ID. And all we want to do is be able to prove that we can access this value within our inbox component in our case. So first of all, in our routing configuration, how do we indicate this parameterized URL? And so it would look something like this. So the colon here is significant, where this is telling React Router that this part of the URL is actually going to be variable. And in this case, we've just decided to call the variable user ID. So that's kind of the first question answered. The second question then is, how does the inbox component actually access the particular parameter value that's appearing in the browser's address bar? And so here I'm showing you our inbox component, and really all I want to do is just display, have the component display the parameter value, and that will suffice to prove that the component can actually access it. And so here's the key part. Turns out that the URL parameter is going to be passed to our component as a prop. The prop has got quite a long-winded name there, but the match prop is not a prop that we define. It's actually defined by the React Router. And so the React Router takes care of injecting or passing this prop into our component for us. And the match component is actually an object, and the key within that object is a key called params, and the params is an inner object which eventually gives us access to the actual user ID value. So that entire expression there, props.match.params.user ID, that will evaluate to whatever's currently appearing in the browser address bar. Now it turns out that the match prop, in order for that to be available to our component, we have to use a special function called the with router function, which is provided by the React router library. And so you can see there that what I'm doing is I'm calling this function, I'm passing it my component, my custom component. And what the with router function does is it returns a component, and the component it returns is a kind of an enhanced or an enriched version of the component that we pass to it. And for example, one of the enrichments is the fact that our custom component is going to have access to the match prop that we're referring to there. And there are some other routing related props that the with router would make available to us as well. One called the history prop, which we will actually use further down the line. So that's a special little technique actually. What with router is referred to is a higher order component. A higher order component is a function that takes a component and returns a component. And the component it returns is an enhanced version of the component that it receives. It's a technique that a lot of third-party React libraries actually use. Okay, so to just tie all this together now, we need to look at sample 3. So let's first of all reset this to sample 3. This is the home page for sample 3, and just by way of illustration, so I've just coded 2 hyperlinks in my home page. And if we click on this hyperlink, then see what's happened in the address bar. I now have 1234 inbox/1234 as the URL, and this is what my inbox component generates. And here I'm actually displaying the parameter value. So this is kind of proving to me that the inbox component code that I showed you there a moment ago was able to access the parameter value. In other words, the props.match.params.user ID, that is what generated this value here. Okay, and if I go back to the home page, if I click on this link instead, this link forces the URL in the browser to change to /inbox/4321, but still my inbox component is able to access that value. So I've now kind of confirmed that I can actually access the parameter value from the browser's address bar. Let's look at the actual source code. So because there's a little bit more going on in the inbox component, I've separated that out into its own file. But if I look at the index.js first, and in particular the home component, so here's the 2 hyperlinks that I exercised there a moment ago. For illustration purposes, one of the hyperlinks I've coded using the link component that we talked about earlier on. I actually coded the other one using the standard HTML anchor tag. For one reason, really, just to show you that if you had another application, React application, or any type of client-side browser-based application that wanted to refer to our React application here, all it would need to do is have an ordinary anchor tag, and as long as it used the right URL, then the browser would redirect this anchor or hyperlink to our application, and our application can still pick up this value. Okay, so other than that, well, we've already discussed in our routing configuration how we tell the React router about the parameterized part of the URL. And what's left then is we're referring to the inbox component here. The inbox I have imported from inbox.js, which is this file here, which we've already discussed. But again, so we've already discussed this code. Okay, that's sample two and parameterized URLs. A very common feature of any React application would be parameterized URLs. Now, you can see there's lots of other samples that I need to talk my way through, but I'm not actually going to cover the other samples in this lecture. I will cover them in a later lecture. I'm essentially kind of covering the routing detail as we need it vis-a-vis the movies fan app that we're rolling out in the labs. So that's really all I'm going to cover in relation to navigation and routing in this lecture. Okay, thanks.